Early Access has always had this kind of cursed aura surrounding it. On the one hand, you've got molten gold, then there's more questionable options where finding a diamond can be done, but you'll have to dig through mountains of coal. In the first case, Ultrakill comes to mind, a title I've been purposefully starving myself of until it hits its full release. There's also Baldur's Gate 3, which originally launched in Early Access to great success. In the latter case, you've got Ark, Survival Ascended, an entirely unnecessary title with paid store-bought DLC and in-game purchases on top of its $45 base price. Or Craftopia, which has had middling updates since its developers put out the arguably more successful and similarly early access Palworld. Today we're looking at Last Epoch, an ARPG dungeon crawler in the same vein as Diablo. It launched as an early access title developed and published by 11th Hour Games and has had praise heaped onto it pretty steadily since that initial launch into early access. It's a game that I have played off and on even before 1.0 and only recently beat front to back, so I can ask and hopefully answer the question, is Last Epoch worth it? I'm sure you know the basics by now. When enemies die, they drop loot of varying qualities. That loot has semi-randomized attributes, often based on its rarity and the kind of item it is, and you equip the loot you've gained to build out your playstyle in specific and interesting ways based on your character's class and the skills you have access to. This game has 5 classes: Sentinel, Primalist, Acolyte, Rogue, and Mage. But that is only the beginning. Once you reach a certain level, you gain access to one of your chosen class's 3 masteries. These are kinds of advanced subclasses that fit a specific kind or kinds of playstyles, while the base class has a little bit of everything found within them. The Acolyte's initial skill tree has access to both debuffing abilities and summoning skills, but the really interesting stuff for either style of play can be found in the Warlock and Necromancer masteries respectively. You don't have to spec specifically into skills themselves to have them unlocked. They just become unlocked naturally with points allocated into the tree itself, and choosing one mastery doesn't completely shut off access to the other 2. Instead, it only partially limits access to it by not allowing you to level into a different mastery tree past a certain point, but it doesn't stop there. If you found yourself wanting a less complicated skill tree than Path of Exile and skill variety more interesting than Diablo 3's pick one of these options skill selections, Last Epoch has you covered. You can choose 5 abilities to use at any given time, and at certain level thresholds you can choose to specialize into a skill you have unlocked. This specialization is another entirely separate skill tree with its own experience bar and level, separate from that of your character. Yes, this means every single skill in this game has its own individual skill tree with varying perks and downsides depending on where you decide to invest your skill points. These changes can be drastic and others are basic. Your skeletal mages, for example, gaining a flat damage buff or leeching off of criticals they make is always nice, but you can also choose to summon cryomancers and or pyromancers with debuffs that can scale both proc, chance, and damage based on other skills you've chosen in the tree. Some of these skill changes can also be affected by changes made to other skills or have a chance to proc other skills, even if you don't have them on your skill bar. There's some downsides, of course. As mentioned earlier, you're limited to only using 5 skills at any given moment, and as a result, there are only 5 skill specializations available. I'd love if you could have access to more skills and specializations, but I know they probably don't allow it for balancing reasons, even if the limited number of possible skills might encourage falling into a specific routine after you found your favorites. Granted, that would still be an issue even without that limitation, but at least then it doesn't feel like it's something you're meant to do so much as something you're choosing to. Another thing that'd be nice is if the skills, when hovered over, better reflected the changes made through the skill tree. As it is, it only shows the most basic variant of the skill, which is not as helpful when you're trying to work out synergies at a glance, or, in the case of a summoning skill, see if you've hit the cap for max summons for that skill. Of course, next up's the gear. In terms of equipables, you've got a helmet, 2 rings, an amulet, a chest piece, some leggings, slots for either hand, some gloves, some boots, a belt, which determines the amount of health potions you can carry, and a space for relics, which are specific towards your chosen class. You've also got dedicated inventory space for idols, which provide passive benefits while in the inventory, which I deeply love, thank you Diablo 2. There are some caveats to the gear that drops though. First thing you might notice is that health potions drop on the ground, but you don't actively pick them up like you would the rest of your gear. There isn't even a spot for them in your inventory screen. They're grabbed automatically if there's an empty slot available, or used automatically if there isn't and you're low on health. Otherwise, you would have to use them manually. Some of your skills and potential equipment can change how potions function, like replacing the health gain with ward, a kind of decaying shield. You might also notice these strange shards dropping on the ground. Those are affix shards. See, Last Epoch features a crafting system wherein you can theoretically craft your own gear, and or upgrade existing pieces of gear. There are generally up to 4 base slots on any one piece of equipment, depending on a number of factors. Rarity generally dictates how many slots you can craft affixes into. Forging potential is a number or a pool, and every affix shard you want to apply has a range of numbers that it can potentially remove from that forging potential when used. The exact amount landing somewhere within the range presented on the screen, chosen at random when the crafting itself occurs. Once that number hits 0, you can no longer mess with the affixes of that piece of gear, but as long as there is at least one forging potential, you can place or upgrade an affix regardless of its presented range cost. That's a basic summarization, but it's important to note there are glyphs and special crafting materials that can be bought or found through standard gameplay that can go beyond what standard crafting can allow, such as granting a 25% chance to cost no forging potential at all when you craft, or dismantling the weapon and nabbing shards from random affixes on that gear. Going even further than that, though, is something of a special case. The standard rarity pool goes as follows: common white, magic blue, rare yellow, unique orange, set green, and exalted purple. And hearing that list, you might think that exalted must be the Last Epoch equivalent to legendaries. Barring some specific instances like drops tied to seasonal events, or say a drop from an empowered nemesis, legendaries are equipment you have to make yourself. You can't do any kind of affix crafting with unique or set items, which is a shame. Exalted items, however, though you might not necessarily want to, since they natively roll at least one tier 6 or 7 affix, which is something you yourself can't craft, you can freely craft affixes onto exalted items. And there's a reason for that. There is a special dungeon in the game that, after clearing, offers you the option to combine one exalted item and one unique item together to create a legendary item. The requirements are as follows. 1. The exalted item must have all 4 slots filled. 2. The unique item must have at least one legendary forging potential, a number that would range from 1 to 4. 3. The exalted item and the unique item must be the same item type. So what actually happens when you manage to make a legendary item? Well, the legendary forging potential determines how many of the exalted item's affixes become attached to the unique item, and the affixes that get moved are chosen at random. This means that something with a legendary forging potential of 4 would result in the final legendary item getting all 4 affixes of the initial exalted item. Theoretically speaking, you can have an exalted item with every affix handpicked by you, barring any especially high rolls on affixes you want to keep, and transfer all of those affixes onto a unique item with effects your build shouldn't go without. This is how you can make some truly monstrous gear. It's the final tier of item rarity, Legendary Red. It's one of the most interesting parts of the game. Some aspects I don't like. Of course, every single part of the system is reliant on some amount of RNG, which can get annoying from time to time. But that's the nature of RNG itself. It contributes towards the game's replayability and feeds into the inherent item grinding these kinds of games are known for. Another addition to what games in this genre are infamously known for is the story, which here is, unfortunately, I won't go too in the reads here, but I can say that the story has something to do with time travel, which in itself is an interesting premise that can feed into a limitless wealth of ideas. You have the entire breadth of your setting's timeline from the start of the in-game universe to the end, but the execution here is lacking, and even the more interesting stuff that you gain access to later via the endgame monolith system doesn't have as much impact. The plot feels like an excuse for the gameplay to happen first and foremost, which is fine for the kind of game that it is, but it still feels weird to have such a potentially limitless pool from which to draw the gameplay from, only to result in what happens here. Of course, the addition of time travel does lend itself to being a bit more free-form with environments, and in some places they can feel somewhat inspired, but for the most part the areas and even the music can blend together to a degree that makes the game's locales feel lacking. There is no single area or musical track that stuck with me even after I was done recording, which wasn't helped in the one instance the audio glitched out shortly after I started as a Sentinel character. I've had this game crash on me twice while browsing the in-game cosmetics store, only then, which was weird, and the UI has bugged out on me a couple times. If you have summons of any kind, normally they have icons that appear as part of the user interface to let you know what kinds of summons you have, how many, and what their health is depending on the summon. On more than one occasion, this simply wouldn't appear. There are some patch notes suggesting that this shouldn't happen anymore, and while it hasn't since that patch, it would be a lie to say it never happened at all or didn't at the time affect my playthrough. When you've got multiple different kinds of summons from the same skill, it's important to know if you need to replace some you've lost or when you've misclicked and need to cycle through your summons to bring out the ones you want. Which leads to the next issue: sometimes the game would only summon one type tied to a skill, when I'm able to have multiple kinds of summons from the same skill. My skeletal mages are supposed to come in 3 different varieties, thanks to how I went through that skill tree. The basic one, the cryomancer, and the pyromancer. Now, there have been multiple instances where the game only summoned one of them and refused to bring out the others no matter how many times I used the skill, negating the entire point of half the skeletal mage skill tree. This has happened with the summon skeleton skill as well. The temporary solution was logging out, then logging back in, but that never lasted. Still not the most annoying thing I came across though, no. The most frustrating problem I came across was tied to the nemesis system. So every so often you'll come across an interactable object that shows you 4 items and 3 options. Banish, Challenge, and Empower. Banish causes the nemesis to disappear, but the next time the 4 items available will have refreshed, meaning 4 different items will have taken their place. Challenge spawns the nemesis, and once that nemesis is beaten, it drops the items as they were presented when you pressed Challenge. Empower will spawn the nemesis, but the items will not drop. Instead, the 4 items will get stronger, and the nemesis will appear later again with those items so you can empower once more, banish it if you've changed your mind, or challenge it if you want them as they are at that time. You can only empower a certain number of times before the option ceases to be an option, leaving you to either banish or challenge. Here you can see me empower because there is a Phantom Grip, a unique ring that imparts benefits that are great for summoning, including, and most importantly, a flat +2 to all summon skills. So I naturally choose to empower. Then later I come across the nemesis in a different area and am excited to empower it again, only to find... even looking back on the footage, I'm still pissed about this. I just want to know what caused this so I never have to deal with it again. Yes, I already had a Phantom Grip. 2, actually, but that one would have been empowered. It would have been great. But you know what? Despite that, and despite the UI bugs and forgettable music and the setting and all that, I still really like Last Epoch. I might have some gripes with the crafting system, but those are minor compared to the sheer potential of theory crafting possible affixes to mess around with, or the brilliance of making legendaries so inherently your own that you're directly involved in the creation process. The multiple skill trees of the class and masteries allow for mixing and matching various hybrid playstyles, and the insane variety therein is just great. Not to mention the skill trees of the skills themselves, pushing that even further. Yeah, there's always going to be best in slot and meta choices, but there's still so much you can do that following a meta build would ruin half the fun of the game. At least it would for me. I really like Last Epoch, and it's a pretty easy recommendation for me to make. Next up is probably Night Raid. Unless it isn't. I'll see you later. Story out.